Hello and welcome back to Alan Moore's Photography. I'm Alan. This is video number 2 in our 3-video series covering the basics of macro photography. It's really geared for people who are just getting started. And in this video, we're going to look at some of the ways that you can modify your existing gear and use those modifications to let you get out, do some macro photography without having to make a huge financial commitment. So let's get started. By definition, a macro lens is a lens that will reproduce the subject you're photographing at a ratio of 1:1, meaning that if you photograph a dime with this Tamron 90mm f2.8 macro lens, the size of the image of the dime on your sensor will be exactly the same as the size of the dime. That is 1:1 magnification. And I'm going to show you 4 different ways that you can approach and in some cases go beyond 1:1 magnification. And for this we're going to use a very standard classic lens, a 50mm lens to demonstrate this. Understand that for all of the techniques I'm going to show you, the shorter the focal length of the lens, the more magnification that you will be able to get from these techniques. And once you get much above 50 or 60 millimeters of focal length on the lens, these techniques really don't work. But you can get startling results with a 50mm Nikon lens like this. This is a $100 lens. What's beautiful about it is it has an entirely mechanical aperture control ring, which is important because this lens in several of these methods is not going to be connected to your camera in the regular sense. So this is a fantastic lens to demonstrate with. Now when the lens is mounted on your camera normally, it is usually going to be reproducing the objects that it is seeing. It's going to be reducing them in a far smaller size. For example, when you photograph a tree, the tree will be many, many times smaller than in real life. That is because the lens is mounted in this direction and it's designed to do that. But the 4 methods that can allow you to use this lens to do macro photography include: 1, adding a magnifying glass to the front of the lens; 2, reversing the lens, and I am not going to get into the optics of any of these because it's complicated and I don't want to lose you. I'm just going to show you practically. Reversing the lens is the next way. Adding distance between the camera and the lens is the 3rd way, and adding a lens between the camera and a reversed lens is the 4th way. And each of these has its advantages, and each of them also have their cons. But I'm going to show you first the simplest way, and in my opinion the least effective way, and that is to simply add a magnifying glass to your lens. Now a lens like this has a 52mm filter ring, and many manufacturers, including whoever made this one, I honestly can't remember, I got it at a garage sale, I would never use it, but this can screw directly into the filter ring. You'll see I actually have an additional ring here, a step-up ring, because this was the wrong size for this lens, but these rings are cheap and easy to find. And what this essentially does is add 1 lens from a pair of reading glasses to the front of your lens, and it offers some degree of magnification. In fact, these these close-up filters, as they're called, usually come in 4 common strengths, 1x, 2x, and 4x, with the 4x theoretically giving you a magnification of 4 times the magnification expected with the lens alone. The problem with these are, because of the curvature of the lens, they have a tendency to flare and they have a tendency to ghost, both of which can dramatically decrease the appeal of the photographs and in many cases just destroy them. If you were going to try this, I would recommend the Hoya, H-O-Y-A. The Hoya brand make probably the better close-up filters that are out there, but I still don't like them and I generally don't use them. So the second alternative that we have is to mount the lens backwards on the camera. This switches around the elements without changing the focal distance of the lens. The lens remains, the center point of the lens remains 50 millimeters from the plane of the sensor, but instead of having the large object focused down to a small image on your screen, you are taking a small image and you are catching it at your sensor greatly magnified. So the way we do this is with what's called a reversing ring. These reversing rings have a male bayonet adapter, so you need to buy them for your particular camera because different cameras have different mounting bayonets. And with the correct thread size for the lens you're going to be reversing. These things only cost a couple of dollars. Photodiox was the maker of this one, and I really think it didn't cost more than $4 or $5. The reversing ring screws into the filter ring of your lens, and then the whole mess attaches to your camera like so. Now you have a reverse-facing lens that will allow you to approach, with a 50 millimeter lens, it'll allow you to approach a magnification of about 0.9 to 1, which is awfully close to 1 to 1, which is our target. This is a great, easy, cheap way to do macro photography. The rear element of your lens is very exposed during this technique, so be very, very careful that nothing strikes or scratches or hits this. There is an adapter that's made for another purpose. This is the BR3 adapter made by Nikon that I purchased just so that it will fit onto the bayonet on the rear of the lens. I put it on just to give me a little bit of protection. That is not mandatory. You don't need that. It'll work just as well without it. The third method involves moving the lens away from the camera. And the way we do that is to use another inexpensive gadget called an extension tube. It's actually extension tubes because they come usually in sets of 3. As in this case, you have one of 20 millimeters, one of 12, and one of 36. These are the fancy extension tubes. Fancy because they actually have electric and mechanical contacts, which allows the camera to communicate with the lens as it normally would. This is still cheap, less than $20, but you can buy them for $5 or $6 without the mechanical connections. And honestly, macro photography is something that is best done manually from start to finish. I find no advantage to having the connector pins for autofocus because really in macro photography you're not going to be using autofocus. At least the way I do it. The difference between these extension tubes and the cheap ones I was telling you about, in addition to the fact that this has the electrical connections, is the inside of the extension tube is treated with, it has small ridges in the plastic which help to prevent reflection. Reflection is a big problem if you have very inexpensive metal extension tubes. Sometimes the interior surface is shiny and it can cause all kinds of light problems and aberrations. But all you do with these devices is place them on the camera as you would a lens, and then place your lens onto, well, let's do it right. Place your lens onto the extension tube like so. In this case, this is a 36 millimeter extension tube. It is very difficult to calculate precisely how much magnification you're going to get, because it depends on the lens, on the distance to the subject, and many other variables that you have to consider. But an approximate rule of thumb is if you add 50 millimeters of extension, which would require you to add one of these, probably the, actually both of them. If you were to use all of these extension tubes together with a 50 millimeter lens, it would get you right up there to 1-to-1 magnification. So this is another cheap, inexpensive way to go. When you use extension tubes, your working distance, that is the distance your object can be away from the front of the lens, will shrink with longer extension tubes, making it harder and harder to light the subject and focus on it without scaring it away. Another thing, extension tubes are going to give you no benefit if your focal length of your lens is much above 50. Much more effective with a lens with a focal length, say, of 24 or 28. So the fourth way is the most complicated way, but also a way in which you can get the most magnification. And a good rule of thumb is, in most cases, the more magnification you get, the more problems creep into the photography. There are complications with higher magnification, not the least of which the amount of light that can get to your sensor with some of these more complicated setups. But the fourth way involves taking a lens, another lens, a prime lens, preferably a longer focal length lens. In this case it's 90, but you could use 100 or 150 millimeter lens. It does need to be a prime lens. The lenses with a zoom feature tend to be unreliable with this particular setup. But all you need to do here is attach the lens as you normally would to the camera, and then use what's called a coupling ring. A coupling ring has thread on both sides, on both edges, one for a filter ring of a reversed lens and one for the filter ring of the primary lens. This is the primary lens, and this is going to be the reversed lens. Now, the lens is going to be going on backwards, just like it did in the second example of the reversed lens. But these little gadgets, again, only cost a couple of dollars, also by Photodiox. The problem is, though, this filter ring is a 67 millimeter ring, I believe, and this is only 52. So in order to couple these, I have put together a set of step-down rings, and this is how this would work. These are rings that are designed specifically for this purpose, to take a filter ring of one size and change it to a smaller or larger. So I'll just apply the step-down rings, and on the last piece I attach is the reversing ring, and I'll take my 50 millimeter lens, and I'm using using it reversed, I will simply screw that onto the end like so. Now, if you're going to do this, open the aperture on your front lens, the reverse lens, all the way. You can actually see it open all the way to f1.8. And now you can use the aperture on the primary lens to control your depth of field. So these are 4 very practical, simple ways to take a standard 50mm lens or a lens of shorter focal length and convert it to a macro lens for the cost of a couple of metal rings, possibly a cheap set of extension tubes, or to make use of another prime lens if you have one. And all of these work really, really well. They don't work as well as, or they're not as easy to use necessarily as dedicated macro lenses, primarily because the dedicated macro lens usually is going to give you more working distance and, depending on the lens, a greater depth of field. So they are easier to work with. Of course, they're custom designed for that very purpose. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with using that reversed 50. That 50mm prime lens is so versatile and it is so sharp. It's sharp mounted front ways, it's sharp mounted backwards. And I think that if you're just looking for a way to get outside and get a feel for macro, see what the hidden world out there looks like, it'll blow your socks off. It really will. It is. I've been doing this for years, and it never ceases to blow me away. The intricacy and the beauty of houseflies, for crying out loud. And once you start taking photographs of really tiny things, you'll be photographing everything that you can get your hands on, because it really is. It's a different universe there. It's something we ignore around us all the time. But once you get a macro lens in your hand, you won't be able to ignore it anymore. So I hope this was useful. If I left something out or there was something you didn't understand, please just leave a comment and I'll get back to you. The next video in the series is going to be looking at how we deal with lighting, because that's another big issue. So far we've dealt with the stuff you need to take with you in the bag, and now you know how you can get away without using a macro lens. And in the next video we'll deal with how you get enough light onto your subject to get good photographs. So I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good day. Take lots of nice pictures and stay safe. See you next time.